I must say, Christopher, I did have my suspicions that air conditioning wasn't going to be the solution to your algebra woes, and then he fessed up. Anyway, more power to the educators of Western Sydney, and good luck with anyone who's trying to teach Christopher. But our education theme continues now with our first panel, Building Schools and Skills to Meet Demand, and I'd like to invite the panellists to the stage, if I could, as I introduce them. I'm sure they're coming from all corners of the room. But brief introductions today, because we do have a packed program, and of course we're already running behind, so less of me and more of them. But when they appear, materialise on the stage from your left, if they follow their instructions, will be John Black, the Managing Director of TAFE New South Wales. Then Linda O'Brien, Dr Linda O'Brien, the Principal of Granville Boys High School. Antony Manning is the CEO of School Infrastructure New South Wales. And Professor Lisa Jackson-Pulver, AM, is the Pro-Vice-Chancellor, Engagement and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Leadership at WSU. And our moderator, Dr Tim Williams, formerly Chief Executive of the Committee for Sydney and now Cities Leader for Arup in Australasia. Please make them welcome.
Just imagine what would have happened if Chris Brown had finished his education. I do think we should tell him that tilting at windmills was something that Cervantes got the man of La Mancha doing, imagining that windmills were castles. Whereas I think Rob is dealing with some real issues, but not in a futile way. I think the debate he started is crucial. I come before you and my colleagues here as a not just former Chief Executive of the Committee for Sydney, but a qualified teacher, who was correctly never allowed to stand before teenage children. I can go anywhere. I've been into number 10 Downing Street, I've been in to see premiers and the Prime Minister, and I will not stand before a classroom of 13-year-olds. So, because I think it's the scariest thing that anybody could be asked to do. So I'm delighted that other people do it and they do it well. Our conversation today is a meaty conversation, partly about building infrastructure, but also have we got the right skills being built in Western Sydney, and are we offering that amazingly burgeoning region and its peoples the right kind of future? And to help us explore these, we've got an expert panel, John Black, Antony Manning, Linda O'Brien, Professor Lisa Jackson-Pulver, to explore these issues. I've got some formal questions first. I come into discussion actually with wearing two sort of hats in a way. One is around, I am actually the father of a teenage daughter who is at state school on the Northern Beaches. And it's a good school and she's getting a good education. And I urge people to explore, who have not, explore state education, because it should be the norm. And secondly, I come also as somebody who worries about the building of cities. Because in my experience internationally, and particularly in the UK, the education departments, frankly, were the slow learners in the building of cities. I.e., for some reason, their processes were very internal, very introspective, and they were quite slow to work out that sort of areas were declining or growing, and then to plan accordingly. So we were forever in the UK closing down capacity in areas that were about to explode in terms of population, on not building fast enough in places that were growing. I know these are real challenges here as well, and I stop with just one big idea, and a big worry I have is that we hear the rhetoric, quite correctly I think, of massive growth west of Parramatta in Sydney, and people have used this idea that we're building a city the size of Canberra west of in Macarthur area. Canberra has 38 schools for the same population. So we really have to get our skates on and think big about the next 20 years. And to help us do that, I know we've got the right people. So I'm going to start with Antony Manning, whose huge responsibility and joy, no doubt, is to deliver some of the vision that we heard from our excellent Education Minister. Now, there's loads going on, Antony, and I'm just going to dig in by asking you about how you see the challenge, what you're doing. We've heard about the number of schools that you're already planning, but you've also changed, you've got some interesting things going on in terms of the form. We've got a kind of vertical school emerging in Parramatta. So how are you facing up to the challenge? What sort of things are you digging into already? Antony first.
Certainly, as the Minister said, there are sort of two challenges facing school infrastructure predominantly at the moment. The first one is we've got over 180 projects that are funded and are currently happening in some form or other. They're either in late stages of planning or in the early stages of delivery. But the bigger challenge is not kind of what we've got in front of us, is what we've got immediately ahead, is beginning to look at what are the projects that we need to be working on over the next 2 or 3 years to set ourselves up. Certainly one of the challenges within that really is addressing the demands around the densification of areas, right, and the challenge that has to what is seen as a normal traditional piece of infrastructure, i.e. a school. The idea of a single or 2-storey building in the middle of a 3-hectare site with playing fields on is really not possible now in some of the areas we've got. So some of those challenges are really leading us to look at sort of high-rise, it's probably really more medium-rise density schools. There's one around the corner, which is really leading the charge on that as a high-rise school, 17 stories. It's on its way up and will be a challenge in terms of how we operationalise it, get it moving, and how we get everybody used to it. So there's some real constraints coming in terms of sort of the availability of land for us to build, but then also the other demands that are going on in the precinct. So what are we looking at in terms of integrated facilities? How do we join up with other facilities and begin to look at how we can share some spaces? Right. We've got joint use agreements now with a whole range of councils. So we're beginning to look at actually how we better use green space, both green space that we have and green space that council has, so that actually we're not replicating, we're not duplicating, but actually we can concentrate our investments in specific areas to improve the outcomes all the way along. So there's a series of challenges really around what would be seen as a traditional piece of school infrastructure, and we're having to get quite inventive and creative about how we go about it, either because we don't have the space or because we know that there's going to be a lot of development around it and we don't want to necessarily kind of use up all the space before everybody gets there as part of that process. And the third part of that is where we see growth, how do we stage that? It used to be very easy to kind of say, well, look, we know ultimately this will be a school for 1,000 pupils. We can build it to 300 for today, upgrade it to 500 in 3 or 4 years' time, and then grow it to 1,000. But where we're talking about sort of medium rise, there really is no opportunity to stage that. It's all or nothing, and then how do we operationalise it through that process? So there are a whole series of those challenges that we're beginning to grapple with, and they're very live and very current. We don't have a great deal of time to sit and think about them. They're happening now across Sydney, and we're responding to them immediately as they go through. And we've got to take the communities on the journey with us as part of that program.
I mean, I think the mood with which you enter this, we would all think is exemplary, in that you've got a much stronger idea than I think most education departments internationally have, that there's a growth agenda to meet. And you've also done it in an era where the whole idea of education is being transformed. And at the same time, we've got people saying, well, the schools shouldn't just be isolated citadels. They need to engage with the community. So all this is not easy in my view. So can I ask you about commissioning schools, the process? Because one is money, which is, have you got enough?
Yep.
And 2, I'm close, tell us honestly. And secondly, and say you haven't actually. It's important to say you haven't, and therefore we can put pressure to get more for you. But money's obviously always an issue. 2, I think, is knowing when places are going to go forward. So the whole collaboration, cross-government, understanding. I suppose, and a subsidiary in that is, has it helped having the Greater Sydney Commission? Are you involved in that kind of city planning?
It's really helpful. So the biggest challenge is predicting growth.
Yeah.
And there are a range of measures we can begin to look at. None of them will necessarily agree or line up in terms of what we think that growth will be. But getting the right baseline in place, getting an understanding of strategically where are the right locations. Yeah. Greater Sydney Commission is a fantastic sort of mechanism for us to sit down with other government agencies, begin to look at a much bigger plan. How do we integrate schools with transport? How do we look at sort of the normal school system with TAFE? How do we begin to understand what it looks like from a health perspective? Where government already owns substantial land holdings, how do we integrate something interesting into that process? And how do we look at how development will be led and what we need to do to meet that? So that's really, really helpful for us to get a really good scan and to go back to government and kind of say, this is what the bill looks like. Now, there are a bunch of things we can do to try and shave that, make it less painful. Yeah. But the reality is there's a core cost that's got to be met. But it does allow us to be really explicit about where the growth is coming from, what the value is, how that fits, and therefore what the urgency is around that wrestle for capital across government.
So just one last thought before we go to our next speaker. The commissioning buildings. So in England, they went big time, and I was part of it. I was part of an industry making money out of PPPs, actually. And they were built as a way of doing templates, which would then be cheaper. And in fact, they were so overspecified that it became massively expensive, right? So I think, on the other hand, on the one hand, there are economies of scale to be got out of building programs. On the other hand, you can get one size fits all, and actually you can end up it being more expensive, perversely. Are you commissioning bespoke each time, or is there a program?
To some extent, we have been commissioning bespoke, and we're beginning to kind of address that. So one of the challenges for school infrastructure is actually to be the centre of expertise in terms of those things. So I don't need to step outside of the organisation to procure it. We know what good looks like. We know how to go about delivering good. We need the horsepower on the ground to do it, and there are various procurement methods to do that. But we need to be the expertise. We need to be the bridge between the educational models and what good teaching looks like, and what the latest models are, and the challenge on infrastructure, and then how we then communicate that to industry to have those things delivered. So we see that increasingly school infrastructure will be the place where the smarts are developed.
Yeah.
We are developing a series of models that we think, from an infrastructure point of view, give us a huge amount of flexibility, and then allow various teaching models to run within the same space. So we don't have to keep constantly shaving the infrastructure and changing it and tweaking it, but it can begin to evolve within a space rather than be too bespoke. And sometimes there's a temptation to design it within sort of an inch of its life, rather than saying this is actually a 50-year investment.
Well, you can
what will happen over the next 50 years?
You can end up with PPP contracts that are 3,000 pages long that only benefit the lawyers. So I'm a qualified barrister as well, by the way, but there you go. I should have confessed I used to work for the National Union of Teachers back in the 1980s, but I was the one teacher I knew at the time that thought it was important that working class kids could read. So now I've got 3 questions hanging over here. Somebody will pick up. Is STEM, not for answer at the moment, is STEM a policy buzzword? Just hello. By 2050, will kids and uni and TAFE students need a campus, or will it all be done via tele-learning? And the third thing, inevitably this week, has the Fed government's interventions in curriculum, NAPLAN testing, etc., my school, been a help or a hindrance? What would you do differently if you were given a do-over in this space? We'll come back to these things. Dr. Linda O'Brien, actually frontline, running schools. Yeah. What are some of the challenges facing students in Western Sydney? Are we doing enough to respond to them? Do we understand the role of teachers? I'm very sympathetic to teachers. And is our public education system providing the right links, pathways towards higher education, TAFE, etc.? What do you think?
Thank you. I think the challenge is education itself. And what does it mean? There's an orthodoxy around what education is that's being challenged by all manner of ideas. How does the academic side of schooling support the skills that are being demanded in the bigger, wider world? How do the kids who've got access to knowledge all over the place come to school and process knowledge that's presented to them in a less exciting way, perhaps? So the challenge for us is engagement. I've brought along today a group of young people, and I'm very glad that they're here, because these are the sorts of problems that they should be hearing, and these are the sorts of things that they should be thinking about. So the greatest challenge in schools is to provide students with opportunities to ask authentic, meaningful questions. And how do we do that within our curriculum? We do it in all manner of ways. The Minister spoke about the Winston Churchill quote about how we change the shape of our environment and it shapes us. Our job, I think, as educators is to sort of pull the walls apart somehow, because that physical change is obviously going to mean that we're going to have to adapt our teaching to what that physical space looks like. At Granville Boys High School, we've started project-based learning in 2012, and we've been slowly moving towards 7 to 10 curriculum just in STEM and humanities, or STEAM and humanities, which has meant that we've actually had to adapt teachers' practices. Teachers cling on to the knowledge that they have as prized, and they are very passionate about that. But sometimes it may not be relevant to the students. So basically changing the relationship between the teacher and the student about what is being learned is really important. One of the other issues that's challenging is whether or not the skills that the students are learning at school is relevant in the workplace. I've been at a few conferences recently and heard people from the Business Council and from the PwC suggest that the sorts of skills that the business community wants, they want to be able to foster leadership and creativity, empathy skills. They want to ensure physical and mental well-being within their workforce. So we have to offer up a curriculum that gives students these sorts of opportunities. In our school, there is certain complexity and diversity. I'm very, very concerned about equity and making sure that these children have exactly the same opportunities as other people who may be higher up the socioeconomic scale, may have better access to English language and so forth. It's really important that they have those sorts of opportunities. But also it's up to us too to learn more about our communities. I've had the great joy of being part of the wider Middle Eastern Australian community, I suppose, for the last 25 years, and it has enriched my life enormously. But the other thing that's happened in the process is that the challenges that those people face, the complexity, the diversity, it means that it results in innovation, and that makes it extraordinarily exciting as an educator to be in a situation where you are constantly thinking, engaging intellectually, challenging your practice, reflecting on your practice and developing your practice to meet the needs of these students. As I said, it's a wonderful, wonderful opportunity. And then also I've had the advantage of meeting these boys further down the track and meeting their children. I'm actually teaching the children of some of the children that I taught many years ago, and to find out what successes they've made of their lives in very extraordinary ways, extraordinary, ordinary, but generally speaking, future-focused citizens who have great concerns for their children and their children themselves. The other thing too about STEM and about technology, I had an interesting conversation about how we can develop the technology so the technology can do it, but whether or not human beings will take it. It needs to be within, I guess, the zone of development of the individual, that whether or not they take it up. And it's rather unpredictable what will work. And we need to be flexible enough to do that. The other thing that's very challenging is the population growth and what the population is, where they're going to work. Anthony and I were speaking some time ago about this enormous infrastructure build and where the skills, where the workers are going to come from, where the people who are going to do these jobs are going to come from, and what kind of training and what kind of skills does education offer, and are there possibilities, and this maybe is a challenge to TAFE too, to engage in skills development in schools and have a vocational program which is expanded on what we're doing at the moment. The other thing that's really important is community engagement. We encourage all our teachers to work with community partners. We have fantastic relationships with arts organisations, most particularly, or the example I give, with Westwards, and also with the Information and Cultural Exchange. The Information and Cultural Exchange has been able to fund a barber shop, which they've just set up in our school. We've got 3 barbers' chairs, and it's also about gender and about masculinity as well. So the people who are running this are not only barbers, but they're also social workers and youth workers, and so they're running workshops which question children's identity. Another relationship which we have, which is very active and very, very positive, is with Sydney Youth Connect, run by Sheikh Wissam Chakawi, and he works very closely with students and their families about identity, about developing a sense of belonging, because what we do find is, and we've done this through surveys, whether or not there's a cultural understanding of the school, of their population, whether the children feel that that the school fully understands their culture, is something that I think is very relevant. Therefore, elements of culture have to come into the school, which is a challenge to the orthodoxy of the syllabuses and so forth. How do we include who these kids are? One way in which we can do it very successfully is through arts programs, because every culture has artistic expression which can be included into the curriculum. So there are all manner of issues, but I'd like to stress how very, very exciting that potential is, and how, as educators, we have wonderful opportunities to, to educate in a different way. because we have to.
So, Linda, I'm going to take the conversation forward, but I'm sure we'll talk about this again around this stuff. We've heard a lot this week about, we got on the one hand, we've got Gonski talking about critical thinking, and then we've got our own minister having a critique of NARPlan, and it is interesting in the same context. We've got, most of the jobs coming at us in New South Wales, wherever we are, in the next 20 years will be knowledge-rich jobs, and content strikes me as quite as important as critical thinking. I've just been put a question that's been put to me about why don't we teach social skills at school. I'm sure we do. And I also think that I expect schools to do a lot of things that work used to do in socialisation terms 20 years ago, so that's worth thinking about in itself. There's also a question here about crime, which I'm going to ignore, because having grown up in a school where two of my schoolmates actually killed their girlfriends, I'm very unimpressed by the criminality of Western Sydney. I think we overstate it, and I think it's coming on the news every night because there's not a lot of other news going on, and I actually think we overstate that. I do like your point about the interrelationship between the community and schools, although again, I come from a working class mining community. My parents never went to my schools. Nobody ever grew up, had their parents go to these schools at all. So I think it's a broader kind of working class problem rather than just a migrant problem, but I'm sure we'll agree on all these matters. Now, can I turn to, at this point, I think I'd like to go to our proper professor, Lisa Jackson-Pulver, because I'm a pretend one, and ask a question about, we've heard a bit about schools' interrelationship with communities. We've got the fastest growing, I think, Indigenous population in Australia and Western Sydney, I think. How do you see the challenges, the opportunities of this amazing growth agenda? What are the specific challenges you see?
Well, first and foremost, I need to pay respects to traditional owners, and thanks so much to Rhiannon Wright for her beautiful acknowledgement to country. There's nothing better than hearing language being spoken at the start of a gathering like this, and I'm sure everyone here agrees with me that there is an absolute magic in hearing words spoken from a place that's lasted 60,000 years. So I'd like to pay my respects to your family and to all the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that are here today. Yeah, there are particular challenges, but there's also a lot that we can be doing. We know that in Western Sydney is the largest population of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the land. We know that the vast majority of Aboriginal people who come into tertiary education, whether that's vocational training, whether that's TAFE or whether that's university, that they are in all probability the first in their families and also likely to be the first in their immediate communities to do this. So the life-changing opportunities that education provides Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people is profound for the people themselves, for their families and their communities. So when you send someone off to tertiary ed, you're not just growing an individual, but you're growing a whole cohort of people that individual is involved with. But more importantly, or conversely, it's the opportunity for the academy, however way you define that, to learn from them. Because for so long, our education system's been very Western, very mainstream. It's served the needs of some and discarded the needs of many. And it's been up until fairly recently the attitude of, if you don't take it our way, then just go, just leave. And even when I was at school, I was 14 when I left school, myself and the other kids who were Koris were never thought of doing anything beyond finishing school at 14 years and 10 months and doing something else which didn't involve ongoing learning. So we're fortunate in that we've changed that around a lot. We've got some of the best lawyers, the best doctors, the best teachers, the best academics, the best infrastructure developers, aeronautical engineers. We've got people who are phenomenal hairdressers, cooks, chefs, people who run business. I mean, we've got Aboriginal people who are at the top of their field in every endeavour you can imagine. And that is very, very new. And we don't shout from the rooftops because a lot of those people come from here. The place with the largest proportion of Aboriginal people, or largest population of Aboriginal people in the land. I think one of the challenges that we have is to recognise that learning is a many ways thing. You go into partnership with your teachers, and you've just shared that quite clearly and quite well with us about the importance of relationships with the teachers. And I see those young people over there, they were beaming at you when you were talking, and I know that they're in a relationship with their teachers in the process of learning. And I know that their teachers are probably learning as much from them as they are from the system. So for me, the biggest challenge is to really recognise that we have so much to learn from this place that's hosted the longest continuing culture for 60,000 years. I'm looking forward to the day when we speak the Aboriginal languages of these lands as part of what we do, and walking past buildings with Aboriginal words on them that describe that, and us as a society as a whole being really, really comfortable with that. I'd like to also touch on Sir Winston Churchill's quote that was given to us earlier today as well. I'm sorry, I can't help myself. But for me, I believe that we're absolutely in this area and in this wonderful city shaped by our geography. We're absolutely shaped by this place. You know, we've got magnificent rivers, we've got beautiful hills and mountains. So we're shaped by our geography, and thereafter we try to shape it. But I don't know if that's quite what we should be doing. I think we should be embracing our geography and therefore the people of that geography.
Interesting. Diolch yn fawr am eich cyfraniad heddiw. Dwi'n siarad Gymraeg fel rhywun sydd wedi dysgu'r iaith. Afo Ben Byd Bont. Sorry, I'm Indigenous too, but I'm from Wales, so I speak Welsh.
My granddad's Welsh.
There you go. Right, so I hope he was a nice bloke. Anyway, so but the last thing I said was Afo Ben Byd Bont, which is an old Welsh phrase, means let he or she who is a leader be a bridge, which I think is I think institutionally, physically and culturally, that's what we're talking about. I also think the big difference between a place like that I come from and this is this growth and how we can use the opportunity of growth, as Rob was saying, to make the place better through growth and actually recognise historic cultures which underpinned the identity of Sydney for such a long time. So I think I'd be interested to see whether we will do that in this process of growth, it seems to me. I'm going to shift now to John Black from TAFE. And you can pick up some of these themes actually around what is education going to look like, the relation between schools and TAFE, and your own response to what students are actually asking for, because TAFE has been going through its own transformation. So John.
Yeah, thanks Tim, and it's great to be here this morning. Look, I'd probably address each of the other three issues briefly. I want everyone in the room today, in the future, when you see a construction site who are held up in traffic because of a project or something, or in particular, of course, the nature of the discussion today, a new school, don't think of that as a construction site, but think of it as a classroom. That's where we're training people. That's where we're giving people experience, so whether it's a technical design through to obviously fitting the plumbing, the electrical and everything that goes with it. Great opportunities. Also, from Anthony, of course, is the linking to the Greater City Commission's design around precincts. We don't want to duplicate infrastructure. If we've got a TAFE next door that is well equipped, not only from a facilities point of view to deliver vocational education and training, but remember, education and training is not about a building, it's about the teachers delivering it. So we don't want to duplicate things, and I'm very pleased that working with Anthony around some concepts to develop that further, so we can more excitingly, and I think, provide pathways for that vocational, which leads on to Linda, of course, who made that point. And it's interesting that I thought Linda was talking about skills, not education. And whilst we know the link between the two, there is quite a distinct difference between higher education, which is so vital for our nation in terms of the opportunity to think around the theory and development of research and the things that go with that. But complementing that, of course, is we need a highly skilled workforce to deliver on that theory. And that's where TAFE comes in and history, but more importantly, where we're going in the future. And it was really exciting, I thought, in Gonski 2.0 to actually see that recognised about that investment that Linda spoke around vocational pathways. For Lisa, look, we're excited in TAFE because we're by far the biggest trainer and educator of Aboriginal people in New South Wales. We over 40,000 last year, and you're quite right around Western Sydney and the challenges. One of the things I'll say there, and it goes to another point you said, is that the fastest, sorry, I have to correct myself, second fastest growing course we have in TAFE New South Wales today is Aboriginal languages. The sad thing for me, no one knows we do it. And that's one we've got to address, because I believe that engaging those disengaged Aboriginal communities through their language and heritage and culture it makes a huge difference when we can actually bring them then through into further training and education, whether it's in TAFE or university. So that is, I think, something we can really hook on. Now, in terms of the future challenges and the millennial, I've got a millennial son. Now, I'm told he's quite normal. He's on his third career. And they'd be pleased to know, though, that he's got a broad sort of view of the world. He believes he's got the expertise to be a CEO already. And I think this is what we're seeing, is that we as an organisation, whether it's education or training, have got to recognise that today's people have got a much broader view of the world. And they want to skip around and change. So we've got to design learning to meet those needs, and I think we can. Whether it's through schools, TAFE, universities, we provide that flexibility of learning so people can jump from one thing to the other and build expertise over time. We don't have the gold watch mentality that certainly my parents had in terms of culture around how we're learning. So I think there's some excitement there. I know I'm out of time, so I'll be very quick here. The other thing I think I'd like to challenge us to is to think about what I call the Hilux articulation. We are compelling students to stay in school for too long on an academic pathway. We need to recognise, as I think Linda's articulated this morning, the vocational pathway can lead to not only a valuable training and contribution to the economy, but self-worth and those sort of engagement things. So too many disengaged youth, too much unemployment. Let's engage them early through what I call the Hilux pathway. And what I'm saying there is that if you don't finish school until 18 to go in an apprenticeship, it's too late. You want to engage people earlier. So when they turn 18, 19, guess what? They can afford a Hilux. And that's what our youth are looking for. So think about that early articulation. There's nothing to say a vocational education is not as valuable as a higher academic education, and we need to recognise that and respond to it, which is my last point around perceptions of TAFE. And in the relative short time I've been with TAFE, I think we have changed that. TAFE should not be seen as a second choice option, but a first choice. It is equal to a higher education approach, and I'm really seeing that come through now, because even last night we held a forum where we had 50 people coming in wanting to be a TAFE teacher. We had tradies dressed in suits, which terrified me. But we have got to make sure that people know that this is something to recognise, both in terms of value to the economy, which we've spoken about, but also I think what we're seeing more now, the social benefit, because quite frankly the data is very compelling. If you go to TAFE you get a job, you go to TAFE you're going to earn more money as a TAFE graduate in your first employment than you are as a university graduate. And I think we've got to try to get the balance, and I was very pleased last year when I spoke to the careers advisors for schools that they are engaging with us as One TAFE New South Wales to say, how do we do a better job to articulate what those pathways and opportunities are, because we've been closed shop. We've got to put ourselves up there. We've got to celebrate the success of this public education that we have through TAFE. Thank you.
Look, I'm going to ask you at this point to thank our panel for their contribution. We could talk all day and tomorrow about all of this, but we are going to have to stop at this point. Look, thank you very much indeed, all of you. Just chairperson's privilege, just three thoughts. One, you've got to sit there. Sit there. One is, I always bridle when I hear the reference to Churchill, because I grew up in a mining community that was so left-wing that during the Second World War they used to boo Churchill on the screen. Whenever he was on the screen, they used to cheer Stalin to the rafters, right? So that's number one. Even the communists, the Conservative club was run by the communists in my mining village. So number one. Number two, you've got a great opportunity in Western Sydney, which we didn't have in a place like I grew up with, which is basically somebody like me, educated. You to go up, you got out, because there were no jobs that were inspiring or well paid, frankly, anymore. Well-paid working-class jobs gone. So I think the idea that there is an economic draw that enables people to make their careers here is a very big difference. Got to make sure that's real. And the last thing, though, is a bit of a warning I went back to. I think it's not education or training, it's education and training. And I think, and I also think content, because I can tell you that in the private schools of England, they might be doing critical thinking, but it's on the basis of a deep knowledge of Western civilization and its creations, mathematics, science, everything. We must be sure that we create the content for working class kids to succeed in the economy that's coming, because it's a knowledge-based economy. That was my chairman's privilege. Thank you very much indeed. See ya.